Okay, hello and welcome to the International Longevity Center UK's report launch, moving the needle, improving uptake of adult vaccination in Japan, producing partnership with Stripe partners. This project has been made possible by a grant from Pfizer Japan Inc., made to the ILC through the Global Coalition on Aging. And I'm Dr. Noriko Cable, Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the University College London. I've been working with the UK and Japan and social relationship at the well-being, and that I'm really delighted to be assigned to chair this session. And thank you for joining today. Today again, we are delighted to have you with us. We are joined by the expert panel of speakers today. Over the past 2 years, ILC and Stripe partners have conducted a program of work looking at barriers and opportunities to increase uptake of adult vaccination in Japan. Following field research in Japan, speaking to all the adults, industry, experts, and healthcare professionals, they have produced a policy report with recommendations to move the needle on adult vaccination in Japan. Arabella Trower, senior consultant at Stripe Partners, and David, head of the ILC-UK, will be presenting this project and discussing the opportunities on how to increase vaccination in Japan. Our panel will also respond to the report's findings and recommendations and share their thoughts on how we can improve routine immunization in older Japanese adults. We would then want to hear your views in the Q&A. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping rules to go through. Internet issues may affect sound and video, so please do bear with us if this occurs. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat function to communicate with panelists and delegates, as well as a Q&A feature, where we will be collecting questions for the panelists. In the interest of time, we would appreciate it if you could keep the questions short and focused on the topics of today's webinar. If you are having any issues with the audio or video throughout the webinar, try to connect with an Ethernet cable or through a hotspot on your phone. If you get disconnected from the webinar, do use the same link from the confirmation email to join back in. You are all invited to post comments on Twitter using hashtag moving the needle and at ILC-UK. This webinar will be recorded and published for public access on our website and YouTube channel. Presentation slides and the recording will be published the next day. Do submit your questions to our speakers using the Q&A feature in the bottom bar of your screen throughout, and join the conversation on Twitter using at ILC-UK and hashtag moving the needle. We will be answering your questions in the Q&A section after our panelists' presentations. So now moving on to the presentation of the report, David will be presenting. Over to you, David.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Cable, and I'm just going to do a very, very brief introduction. I'm the Chief Executive of ILC, and then I'm going to pass over to Arabella to present the findings. Of course, it's not really a great time to be interested in healthy aging, and in parts of the world, health inequalities are getting worse. whilst we've made some progress on universal health coverage, we've still got a long way to go. And COVID, of course, has played a part in impacting upon life expectancy in lots of countries. Clearly, if we want to address this challenge, we've got to address inequalities and increase access to healthcare. And part of the healthy aging story is, of course, vaccination. So we were really delighted to be working with the Global Coalition on Aging and supported by Pfizer on this topic. So over the last decade, we've been working across the world really on adult vaccines, and there are three major themes which come out of this report as well. One is the need to democratize access. By that we mean make sure everyone has access to healthcare services, medications, preventative services. Secondly, win the hearts and minds. So that's how do we engage the medical professions, but also individuals around the value of preventing ill health. And then thirdly, how do we make the most of and use the opportunity of technology? As I say, Arabella's going to talk about the findings of the research we've done over the last couple of years, which looked at how you increase the uptake of routine vaccination in Japan. And of course, the context in Japan is that people aged 50 and over already account for 4 in 10 workers, and more than 3 in 5 yen in the Japanese economy is spent by older households. What we know is that healthy aging is key for the economic success of Japan. So we know that if people are healthier, they spend more money, they care more, they volunteer more, and they work for longer. So health is extraordinarily important in terms of the economy. Clearly, the vaccination story in Japan is complex, and I'm going to pass to Arabella to talk about some of these issues. With COVID, for example, the uptake started relatively slow, but then got to a very high levels. In terms of at least the initial doses. But in terms of routine immunizations of adults, whether that be around flu or pneumococcal, there's relatively low uptake compared to other countries across the world, and the aim of this project was really to explore what we could do in relation to that. So I'm going to now pass over to Arabella to present the findings. So thanks, Arabella.
Great, thanks, David.
Could I introduce Arabella? Arabella is a consultant with the experience in foundational research and tech innovation projects. Her work has spanned a wide variety of industries and topics, including remote working, community organization, social media, and music consumption. Arabella has a background in social anthropology and graduated from Daiwa University. So please, over to you, Arabella.
Thanks so much. Great. So yeah, what I'm going to present today is really a summary of our findings. So I've got some slides that kind of bring together the sort of summary of what we found, and then I'll be focusing on the intervention opportunities that have come out. So the full report will be published, and so you can find that on ILC's website, and we'll share a link with that. So please do dive into that, where there'll be lots more detail around kind of what I'm presenting today, and lots of interesting quotes and kind of stories that came through from the field. Great. So just to kind of start with sort of health and aging in Japan. So really what we found kind of early on is that independence is really important, and work often carries on kind of past retirement. This is not just for money, but many actually kind of enjoyed being busy and felt like it was a sort of key part of who they were and their identity. And so the implications and sort of opportunities around this for increasing vaccine uptake is kind of work, and the ability to continue it really represents a sort of target for interventions and communications around vaccines. Secondly, health was seen as very holistic, kind of mind and body. Lots of people spoke to us about both kind of keeping healthy in the mind and also in the body, and being active is really seen as kind of being vital to maintaining this holistic health. So lots of people talk to us about mobility and the importance of taking walks and kind of taking part in radio taiso. So really this is an area that we can position vaccines as a way to sort of stay mobile and stay active in the community. Third key finding is that raising immunity is really important for people in the way that they kind of think about staying healthy. And this directly linked to sort of Western medicine as well. And we explored this a little bit in relation to Campo, which is the kind of the traditional medicine. Really what we found is that Western medicine was seen as a kind of fallback for the sort of weak and sick, where it sort of treats just like a specific symptom, often at the expense of kind of damaging the sort of whole system. So people saw a lot of Western medicine as really this kind of fallback area, and often they would kind of only use it as a sort of last resort. Vaccines fall into this Western medicine category. So it's important kind of going forward that communication should really focus on shifting the mindset around vaccines to kind of helping raise your immunity in this kind of other space of how people are thinking about their health, rather than a sort of fallback for kind of when you're weak and sick. And then lastly, medical care, what we found is actually pretty accessible when people need it. So people didn't seem to have an issue when kind of accessing clinics. But it was more really like around kind of awareness and understanding of disease and vaccines that was a kind of key barrier in this space. And, lots of people, whether sort of urban or rural, because we spoke to people in sort of different places, had access, whether kind of walking 5-10 minutes down the road, or sort of driving distance away. So medical care seemed to be easily accessible, but there were more issues around sort of awareness and understanding of these disease and vaccines. So this is kind of summary insights from thinking about the sort of Japanese healthcare system. So first of all, preventative medicine is not often part of the national health insurance. Lots of sort of life course vaccines, although subsidized, were not sort of free for people. And one of the few things that were included in people's health insurance for free in this sort of preventative medicine area was the annual health check. So this was a yearly sort of medical examination. But the sort of implication and opportunity around this is that really, we saw the annual health check as a key opportunity to reach people on an annual basis and be able to kind of raise vaccine uptake. But this was not often, discussed at all. Doctors weren't talking about vaccines kind of for a number of reasons, but to see everyone or most people every year is a really, really key point that we could potentially kind of take and make an opportunity with to sort of raise vaccine uptake and awareness. Secondly, what we found is that vaccine policy is set at a national level, but it's the kind of local governments that implement it, and they're the ones that are carrying it out kind of on a day-to-day basis. So really local government should be a very kind of primary target for short-term changes to address these uptakes. And this kind of links to the third point here, is that, budgets to cover vaccine rollouts are often limited. So obviously COVID-19 was an exception. Lots of governments saw, an increase in kind of funding to sort of help roll out the COVID vaccine uptake. But often for sort of influenza and pneumococcal vaccines and kind of policies, they're not often given kind of additional budgets to sort of help local governments implement this. So really, there's an opportunity here for kind of integrated care systems and pooling of budgets, which could help sort of change incentives for local governments around vaccines. And lastly, we talked about past controversies that have kind of led to a cautious approach to vaccines by the government. So this is really around past issues or kind of conversations and controversies around childhood influenza, HPV, MMR. And so often, the government, because of these past kind of concerns, often takes very sort of neutral language around vaccines, and it's rare for them to sort of strongly recommend life course vaccines. So we think that there's, again, a nice opportunity for kind of stronger recommendations and a real focus on the benefits of vaccines in communications from the government. And so now thinking about the kind of vaccine journey in Japan's healthcare system. So firstly, the healthcare system is fragmented. So doctors don't necessarily kind of know who has had a vaccine, and many, don't necessarily feel responsible for discussing this. The Japanese healthcare system is based a lot on kind of specialists, which is great because it means that people have a lot of autonomy over, who they go to and where they go. But what this does mean is that there's not this kind of overview that often doctors have on their patients. So, the introduction of a unified digital health record could really be a chance to encourage doctors to discuss vaccines with their patients and kind of have this greater overview. Secondly, so letters from the local government are a vital trigger to getting a vaccine. So annually, the government sends out influenza letters, which is for many people, a key trigger for people to get this vaccine. And they get a letter through the door. It's a kind of annual thing, and off they go. So we think that this kind of setup and this sort of system that's already in place is a really, really key opportunity for offering kind of targeted communications. So, when people kind of see this letter, it's often, a very key and vital trigger, but also kind of letters are sort of easily put to the side or forgotten about or kind of not seen. But we think that we could, really take advantage of this system and increase communications and the way that they are kind of described and communicated through to people. Thirdly, in cities, we heard that vaccines are not always sort of readily available for walk-ins, and people can often be turned away. So we had one participant who walked in to get a vaccine. They didn't have availability, so she got kind of turned away and has actually never gone back since. So potentially kind of pre-booking appointments for people automatically, or offering sort of more walk-in slots really do represent opportunities for larger cities. Interestingly, walk-ins tended to be not such a problem in rural areas. So this was actually more focused on urban areas, which was interesting and offers more kind of opportunity to sort of understand that in more detail with further research. And then lastly, most vaccines are available at clinics or hospitals, but must be delivered by a doctor or nurse. So they're the only ones that are sort of licensed to give vaccines. And so we think that, making vaccines available in more locations and delivered by other healthcare professionals, for example, pharmacists, could really increase uptake. And we heard from a number of people the kind of trust that they place in pharmacists. Often they felt like they had kind of more one-to-one time with them and direct contact. So this could be a potential area to, again, sort of help increase availability of vaccines. And lastly, sort of a summary of sources of influence, which is interesting. So doctors are, highly influential in this space, but often don't regularly kind of discuss or recommend vaccines to their patients. So lots of people said to us, oh, if my, doctor had told me about pneumococcal or the influenza vaccine and the importance of it, then they would absolutely, have taken it because they place a lot of trust in their doctors and take on their recommendations. However, doctors are not often kind of actively recommending vaccines to their patients. So we think that this is a kind of key opportunity group to sort of target about the importance of vaccinations. Secondly, intergenerational households are very common, and sons in particular tend to hold a kind of considerable amount of influence that we heard with their parents. So, this is important because although we're talking about, the over 65s, actually interventions should really be cross-generational and target younger generations who can in turn influence, their parents as well. So we're not just thinking about kind of one age group here, but actually, go across generations to kind of sons and daughters and grandchildren as well. Thirdly, government information was highly trusted. So even after past controversies that I mentioned earlier, this didn't actually actively kind of come into people's sort of narratives or explicitly play a role. So obviously this may well have been kind of subconsciously kind of setting people's mindsets, but actually, government information was highly trusted. And so government level policy change and messaging, we think that would really have like a high impact on people. If lots of people said to us, if the government felt like it was important, they would be pushing it more. And like, I would, absolutely kind of take action on this. We also discussed with people around kind of adverts and posters and social media. And often these were seen as slightly kind of subjective and untrustworthy sources by older people. But in particular, the news was like a highly trusted source here. And we discussed kind of various awareness campaigns, like there was one about pneumococcal in the past with a very famous actor. And actually these were very good at kind of raising awareness of these different vaccines. So many people spoke to us about this particular campaign, but often it wasn't enough to actually kind of trigger action explicitly. They raise awareness, but there needs to be some other kind of interventions alongside that to actually trigger people to kind of act on this information. However, what we also heard is that social media can have a high impact in professional circles when from a kind of trusted source. So we heard about an example of a tweet from kind of very well-respected medical professional around the importance of pneumococcal. And actually this caused pneumococcal to sort of sell out for a brief time in Japan. So this could be a very effective communication channel to reach doctors in particular, provided it does come from a kind of trusted and legitimate source. So kind of to summarize, attitudes and barriers to vaccines. So what we found is that there are three main barrier groups to getting a vaccine. And what's important to note here is that these are often interrelated and kind of act as compounding reasons for not getting a vaccine. So they don't necessarily, people don't necessarily experience these kind of individually, but often people have a number of these kind of key barriers that they experience that causes them to decide not to get a vaccine. So first of all, lack of awareness. So this is really speaking around like, I didn't know about it. There's kind of no knowledge of the disease at all, no recommendations from people, and they may well have kind of missed the government letter or something like that. So really what we found with pneumococcal and influenza is that letters are, the kind of key effective like channel to raise awareness. Like people aren't really talking about these vaccines or diseases, with their sort of friends and family. So these letters are kind of key trigger. So interventions should, focus in this area on increasing awareness across additional channels. So if letters are missed or, people kind of don't read these letters properly, there should be other sort of ways that we are raising awareness around this. Secondly, a key barrier was that people don't take it seriously. So we heard lots of people saying, I'm really healthy, the disease is not going to kind of affect me that badly. So this is, a lot of belief around a kind of strong immune system. They don't think that influenza is that severe and kind of no sense of urgency, or there's a belief that effective treatments are available as well, if they do kind of catch the disease. And so this group of kind of barriers and people are not necessarily against vaccines, but they just don't believe that they personally need it. They might think that they kind of need it in the future, but right now they don't feel like they'll be affected by it. So intervention should really kind of emphasize like urgency, severity, and the potential health impacts of these diseases, both on themselves and others. And thirdly, this is the ideologically opposed. So this is people who, discuss not wanting kind of abnormal things in their body, very worried about the sort of side effects and damage that these vaccines could have, and wanting to kind of, avoid all medicine if possible. And often like, lots of misinformation around vaccines as well in this group. So this, barrier is the sort of the hardest to shift because it's kind of very ideological and lots of people are against putting sort of things in their body. However, if we can address the barriers kind of 1 and 2 and really create social norms around vaccines, we have an opportunity to change mindsets. So this is really based on the experience of COVID. So lots of people who used to, or who were kind of very against vaccines, the moment that, people had like great awareness and took these diseases seriously, often shifted this ideologically kind of opposed group. So social norms were sort of really important around this, and they saw lots of others getting vaccines around them. Great, so that was a really quick run through of findings, and as I said earlier, I really recommend going through the report in detail. There's lots more information and kind of insights around there. But yeah, so we came up with sort of 3 key intervention spaces that could be effective in increasing vaccine uptake. And each of these intervention spaces would be tackling the 3 key barriers that I just spoke through before. So our first intervention space is to test different messaging strategies and channels. The second one is to develop and test vaccine events, both on a micro and macro scale. And thirdly is to reform the vaccine booking system. So I'll go into more details with these now. So first of all, testing different messaging strategies and channels. So really this framework should be used when thinking about the positioning of future communications and messaging going forward. So we built a framework that focused firstly on benefits, so really emphasizing the benefits of getting a vaccine. Often government letters focus a lot on the side effects and use quite neutral language. And we think if we could also use benefits, really explain these alongside those could be very impactful. Secondly, health. So focus on how vaccines can help raise this general immunity, this kind of narrative that people were thinking about their kind of health and not just used as a sort of fallback when things go wrong. Thirdly, responsibility. So emphasizing the infectiousness of these diseases and the collective responsibility that people should have for others. So often people didn't take these, diseases seriously and didn't actually think that they're infectious and could pass it on to their parents and their friends. The severity, so really explaining the health impact of these diseases and the seriousness of them. Again, people just didn't necessarily kind of understand how flu, for example, could really impact them. Stats, so this is to provide people with up-to-date stats. Number of cases and how many people have been vaccinated, etc., so that people can actually contextualize the disease. The more information they have, the more kind of understanding that they will have around this. And this came to light, especially around, COVID. People were very clocked into, the cases, and that really helped them kind of understand the importance and severity of the disease. And lastly, tackling misinformation. So this is specifically around kind of misinformation claims. So really kind of calling these out and trying to, kind of overcome these stories and kind of understanding or potential kind of misinformation that's flying around. So really what we recommend that needs testing is the precise language of how these communications can be used to kind of resonate most strongly and most effectively around vaccines, and also to test the channels that are most effective for reaching people. So using this framework, coming up with a communication strategy, and then testing this language in different ways. And so using this communication toolkit, we recommend testing the impact through kind of different channels. So there's key channels. So first of all, the government letters, which I discussed. So this is the main communication channel, and the system is already there. So we think that this is a really important and key opportunity to kind of test different communication to resonate with people. And we came up with a few other channels such as Radio Taiso. This is a key group of older people who come and practice kind of stretching each morning, but something similar to this, let's find a way that a place and an area and a channel that lots of people in this key demographic are using. line app. So most people have smartphones. Again, this could be a place where we could provide information like FAQs and kind of send reminders as well. So there was an example of this that was used during COVID and did manage to shift a lot of people's kind of thoughts and understandings around COVID vaccines. And lastly, newspaper. So as I mentioned, older people took an active interest in their health and often engaged with articles and books on the topics, and newspapers really were a trusted source. So can we discuss with journalists more often and get influenza, season to the, into newspapers and lots more kind of coverage here. So specific groups which could be targeted for testing, could be, other members of the family. As I mentioned, cross-generational communication is really, really important. Social care services and centres, these have direct links to older members in the community, doctors, because they're looked up to and respected, and journalists, as I mentioned, to kind of increase the key reporting on these diseases. So, exploring new channels will really raise awareness further, moving away from relying solely on the single government letter, which is at the moment the kind of key awareness channel. So increasing these channels will really reach a wider audience, trigger more discussion, and have reminders, constantly hearing messages. Secondly, using more impactful language will shift key misconceptions around the severity of these diseases. So, testing these different languages, the different use of language will help, increase the kind of understanding of severity, increase professional recommendations, making sure we have trustworthy sources, and really just increase the kind of influence, ensuring communications are intergenerational as well. And thirdly, having trusted and impactful sources will begin to dispel misinformation as well, which is really, really important to kind of overcome for the sort of ideologically opposed barrier that we were discussing. So just targeting trusted health professionals and directly addressing these misinformation claims. So here's just an example case study as to the importance and impact that communication change can have. So here's just a quick kind of example of, increasing UK tax compliance through communication strategies. So just by changing the language, so for example, putting in, highlighting the kind of behavior of others in the tax letter. For example, 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, work to reinforce social norms and behavioral expectations. And as you can see, it really increased repayment by 160 million in the first 6 weeks of testing. So it's really important to, emphasize how simple communication shifts can really, really make a very, very big impact. And here we have just an example, and this is, just for kind of illustrative purposes, but this is an example of a annual influenza letter that someone that we spoke to had come through her door from the local government. And so, by changing, the way that kind of letters are communicated and kind of used can really potentially sort of increase vaccine uptake. So emphasizing the benefits. So for example, in this whole page, there's only one sentence regarding the benefits of the vaccine. So we think by expanding this and making this more prominent, it could, help people understand the benefits of raising immunity. Have an increase of a sense of collective responsibility. So there's actually no mention of, getting a vaccine for others. Communicate severity. So really increase the understanding of how severe this virus is, and make it more visually appealing as well. And this was just a local government letter from a singular ward, but I think it shows a really good example of how we could potentially reform this communication and kind of get it to jump out and stand out to people a little bit more. So secondly, to develop and test vaccine events. So this is both on a kind of micro and macro scale. So firstly, micro, so testing kind of local scale vaccination events to gather further insights into effective methodologies that we can then take forward into a kind of macro event. So this could be like a local health seminar or pop-up hub, and also kind of local training and for healthcare professionals. So we reckon that it would be great to be kind of located in key community locations that are visited regularly or passed by many people, so by a park or a supermarket. And also potentially linked to workplaces. I mentioned the importance of people continuing work. So, the Silver Human Resources Centre was a key one that people use. It would be targeted at obviously kind of people over the age of 65, but also other talks should be intergenerational. And the pop-up hubs, for example, would be visible to everyone in the area. Local health seminars would be kind of run by trusted and respected health professionals, and topics either directly about vaccinations or staying healthy. The pop-up vaccination hubs, people would be able to engage with health professionals and discuss kind of concerns or worries directly. So what needs testing is, the topics of the talks, which community spaces are most effective, and the level of engagement with these hubs as well. And so once tested on local level, a wider national scale campaign can be developed based on these learnings. So, this would need investment and partnership with the government, but could generate a high impact, like National Annual Health Vaccine Day to raise awareness, or kind of mass vaccination events. And again, more kind of training to support this national campaign. And so we envisage it could be something like a National Health or Vaccine Day. It would happen annually, so people start to recognise and expect it, accompanied by talks from prominent healthcare professionals, and even a mascot could be developed, which raises awareness through kind of souvenirs and is each year associated with the disease. And then potentially kind of mass vaccination events that can be run alongside the national campaign. And this needs to be run in conjunction with the local government and JMA, and it could build on the kind of current COVID-19 infrastructure. So events and pop-ups will help start conversations and raise the visibility of vaccines. So really kind of help to focus on this sort of lack of awareness that people have. Secondly, more sources of accessible information and seeing others getting vaccinated will increase this sense of seriousness to people, understanding the severity, and really increasing the kind of urgency of this. And thirdly, having an annual event which many people engage with will help kind of shift this social norms that I was talking about, visibility of others who are kind of healthy getting vaccinated, and just kind of increasing the normalization of this around vaccines. So this is an example of how a pop-up might look, located in a central place, have a little mascot that people recognize, and run by doctors and nurses who can provide information and questions and conversation. And this would be important to kind of partner with the JMA to support licenses for these pop-up clinics. And lastly, to reform the vaccine booking process. So we can use this current vaccine system, which is already in place, to kind of build on. So additional vaccine letter reminders, there's only one sent, every year. So perhaps, if they're sent more, then people will, be reminded and not kind of lose the letter or forget about it. Opt-out appointment system. So people are automatically scheduled, for example, to influenza appointment. For example, for pneumococcal, automatically book people in a week after their eligible birthday. And also discuss 2-in-1 vaccine appointments as well. When they come for a flu appointment, can we think about the pneumococcal appointment as well? And so we would need to partner with local governments, health clinics, and also have a unified digital health record for vaccinations, which is soon to be introduced to Japan. So, additional reminders and pre-booked appointments will work to raise these vaccines to the top of people's mind, reducing missed letters and increasing awareness. Making it easier to attend appointments and getting clinics actively involved will kind of communicate this importance to people. So, having a pre-booked appointment will feed into this idea of urgency and importance from kind of local governments as well. And thirdly, having opt-out appointments will help increase the social norm. Everyone will kind of be set a vaccine appointment. So this is, based on a case study that we saw in Akitakata, which was an opt-out COVID-19 vaccine appointment. So they automatically booked people into their booster appointments at a mass vaccination centre. And they sent a letter with the time and date, which was based on their previous appointment. If people couldn't make the allotted time, then they would call up and reschedule, which seemed to be very, very, very successful. And so lastly, just to kind of wrap up, alongside these interventions, we also suggest further recommendations, which are a little bit more kind of long-term focused and need more kind of complex coordination and development along with governments and influential bodies. Healthcare and system policy updates, so change the first dose of pneumococcal reminders to kind of annually instead of 5 yearly. Often people kind of miss out if they miss their sort of eligibility year and have to wait another 5 years. Electronic health records, which is being developed, include vaccine discussions as part of the annual health checks, reform sort of payment structures, and encourage the government to use stronger language to more actively recommend kind of influenza and pneumococcal vaccines. And also kind of around healthcare professional development, open up vaccine licenses to pharmacists and partner with the JMA and government to develop more kind of lifetime education for doctors to train them on the latest vaccine information. So yeah, that was a very, very quick whip through, but thank you for listening, and I think I'll hand back to David.
Actually, I think it's Noriko.
Sorry.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Arabella. The next year, we like to move on to the panel discussion. The first panel is presenting is Michael Hodin, CEO Global Coalition on Aging. Michael Hodin is CEO of Global Coalition on Aging, managing partner at the High Downtown Group, a fellow at the Oxford University Harris Manchester College, a member on the Council of Foreign Relations, and sits on the advisory board of the Milken Institute Center for the Future of Aging. He has spoken internationally on the topic of aging and convened events with global leaders on the same. He might hold a BA cum laude, Cornell University, MSc in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the MPhil and PhD in Political Science from Columbia University. Michael sent the apology to us, but he will prepare the presentation. So over to the you, David, if you can share the slides, his slides with us.
It's just give us 1 second. It's just coming through.
Hello, and great to see everyone and to be partnering here on the Moving the Needle project with ILC-UK. And congratulations on your great work around prevention globally and particularly on this project in Japan. I'm Michael Hodin, CEO of Global Coalition on Aging. We're the supporters of this value project, Vaccines for All, Longevity Unleashed for Everyone. And it's a project that supports our efforts around adult immunization as one of the most effective and accessible strategies for 21st century health systems to enable healthier aging for all. We're delighted that ILC-UK is rolling out its results of this value project, and we look forward sometime later this year, probably in mid-June, in Japan itself, to bring forward the results of the other grantees in this project of value. It represents a shift from acute and reactive care to prevention. With population aging, adult immunization becomes even more critical to the sustainability of our health systems. Older adults are more susceptible to vaccine-preventable diseases, like influenza, pneumococcal disease, shingles, and of course now COVID-19 itself. These can have cascading impacts on an individual's health, healthcare costs themselves, and the resulting caregiving burden for partners and adult children. Widespread availability and uptake of adult vaccines is a shared interest across society, not just health, including permanent government efforts, employers, caregivers, and individuals and their families. Yet, despite evidence of the importance and value of adult immunization to healthy aging, the focus on prevention, and therefore to society and the economy, the rate of vaccine uptake among older adults remains low globally. Many innovative efforts underway around the world to begin to better understand and address barriers in local and specific ways are themselves gaining momentum. The value story is a unique story of being in the right place at the right time to learn about adult vaccination real time and to focus on our efforts for Japan. Just a few years ago, Japan had the lowest rates of adult immunization among its OECD peers, and consequently among the highest rates of vaccine preventable diseases. In a very short time, and serendipitously, Japan has provided a case study in why adult immunization is so important and valuable for individuals, families, health systems, governments themselves, economies, and also how to achieve high rates of vaccination across older adults. The pickup in usage for COVID-19 has been stunning in Japan, and we hope that that will lead to even greater understanding of why the uptake and usage was so low even 2 to 3 short years ago. Insights from the Value Project in Japan will better our understanding around vaccine hesitancy and create real opportunities to move the needle on adult vaccination rates in Japan, which in turn can serve as lessons globally. Lessons globally for flu, for pneumococcal pneumonia, for shingles, and continued in the COVID-19 pandemic challenges. Local and national strategies for Japan to increase vaccine uptake among Japanese older adults can be seen through working better with doctors and healthcare professionals to reach patients directly, to educate and drive demand for vaccines across the life course, including for adults. Change public narrative around vaccine benefit and safety through the media and underlying communications, even social media efforts. Explore policies that will make vaccines more accessible. Expand who can be vaccinated and where. Coverage and supportive ecosystems to get people to vaccination sites themselves. Policy level communication levers to marry adult vaccination conversations to larger narratives around success for super aging Japan and its healthy aging goals. Thanks again to ILC-UK and its role in prevention strategies aligned not only around adult immunization, adult vaccines, but the broader efforts through the decade of healthy aging. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. The next speaker is the Dr. Charles Alessi, Chief Clinical Officer, éditohealth. Dr. Charles Alessi, the immediate past senior advisor to Public Health England, with leadership responsibilities around dementia, risk reduction and aging. He had regular interaction with the Japanese health and care system and traveled to Japan extensively, lecturing and representing UK at conferences. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I also want to add to my congratulations to the ILC for this pretty comprehensive report. I'm going to use the few minutes I have just to reflect a little on Japan and the transformation we've seen in Japan, and also reflect a little, perhaps, upon the future opportunities we have. So let's start looking at Japan, because Japan, of course, is very different to a lot of places, but we all know that healthcare is very contextualized in the countries that it's in. So in many respects, it's different, but it's not that different to anywhere else, because what works in Japan doesn't work in the next country, but what works in, say, this country certainly doesn't work in the next country either. But Japan has a long history of vaccine hesitancy. And that long history is partly based upon the structure of the system, the health and care system in Japan, but also, I think, the fact there were some adverse issues in the past, which obviously have been remembered. And of course, when we're talking about older people, the memory of older people is related to how long they've been alive. So there are plenty of adverse events that they can hark back to think in terms of perhaps vaccination may not be the most appropriate thing. But we saw something extraordinary happen in Japan with COVID. And it really was extraordinary, because this was a country with a long history of vaccine hesitancy, suddenly become one of the countries that had the highest rates of first vaccinations in the world. And everyone went, whoa, why did that happen? I mean, this was quite extraordinary. And reflecting on it, I think, there were various reasons why that happened. One, there was an issue of catharsis, I think. The Japanese were looking at the West getting into more and more difficulty, with deaths multiplying dramatically, particularly in older, sick, multi-morbid people. And of course, Japan being an aging society, that described a significant number of the population. So that in itself was really, it really made people think that perhaps it's worth getting vaccinated. Secondly, of course, it coincided with the Tokyo Olympics. And you may say, so what? But there was a lot of resistance to the Olympics internally, partly as well because of issues of safety associated with all these people coming over, to a degree that that increased the level of requirement and need for people to get vaccinated. And paradoxically, of course, the world's a very strange place. People get vaccinated when there is a pandemic going on, but stop being vaccinated the moment they don't feel they're in danger. So the fact that everywhere else in the beginning was actually getting into real trouble ensured that the demand for vaccines was significant. So I think that issue was important. The second issue was the fact the route which the government and the central government took to actually get these vaccines out was also interesting. One, they prioritized the profession first. The medical profession and the nursing professions, the healthcare professionals were vaccinated as the first priority. Now that in itself changes an awful lot. And you heard Arabella talk about the value of the opinion of the health professional in Japan when it comes to older people. So the fact that they had been vaccinated actually did make a difference. So that in itself was really quite important. The second issue was the fact that government also encouraged large employers to actually have their in-house vaccination process. And that worked because, of course, the relationship between the employer and the employee in Japan is particularly strong in many respects, or in some respects at least, stronger than perhaps the relationship between central government and the individual. So that is really, really important. Access issues were managed quickly. The whole process actually worked remarkably well. So I think we have some lessons perhaps we can take from COVID-19 of how to transform a country from a vaccine hesitant country into a vaccine welcoming country to a degree, which is really what happened in Japan in COVID-19. But of course, we can't rely or hope. My God, what have I said? Hope? that there will be another pandemic to ensure people get vaccinated. This isn't a route, but perhaps it gives us some insights. And really thinking forward in terms of what we need to ensure we start to embed these processes within the Japanese system. I think there are various things that we can suggest that may be of use. One, the issue of data. Interoperability in Japan is still notable by its absence. It is improving quite dramatically. It was completely absent at one point, but now it is better, but still there is a way to go. And also getting the EMRs into the electronic medical records to provide some transparency so people know what and who needs to be vaccinated. So that issue, I think, is really quite important. Secondly, the physicians. The physicians are really important in Japan for a whole variety of reasons, but the Japan Medical Association in particular is really important. It's very influential in government. It's also very influential in healthcare, and its role is key to actually delivering vaccine initiatives. And I think including the JMA far more in discussion and joining the JMA in the importance of vaccination is something that is perhaps overdue. We need a whole campaign, a whole national campaign, an international campaign to actually move this needle, because once we start moving this needle, perhaps things will change a little bit quicker. We also note, by the way, the value of the health check. And Arabella mentioned that as well. But it's interesting, isn't it? In the health check, the vaccination isn't really part of the process. It's not really mentioned by the clinicians. Hence, it's a perfectly reasonable pushback from older people who say, but sorry, I've just had a health check. Nobody told me about this. It's obviously not important. So what on earth are you telling me to have a vaccination now? So getting a little bit more join up back to process here, perhaps, is really quite important. But clearly, we understand this globally. Metrics drive a clinical system, and this happens all over the world. And how people are paid, the requirements that are necessary for people to get paid actually do drive behavior. So perhaps a look at the metrics of health checks to include vaccinations could be particularly helpful. The third issue is the role of primary care. The role of community services in Japan, many respects notable by its absence. Its system is extraordinarily good. It's one of the best places to get super specialist care in a whole host of different conditions. But a system which doesn't have a generalist to follow and assist somebody through their life journey does have some deficiencies. We know through WHO initiatives now that non-communicable diseases are best managed through a life course. So where is the navigator that assists the Japanese citizen through their life in assisting them risk reducing their chances of developing illness? And of course, vaccination is a significant part of that. Not something that can be fixed in a hurry, but something that certainly needs some reflection and perhaps some novel solutions, also digital solutions, of course. The fourth issue, I think, is access. Access to vaccinations. Again, the fact that only doctors, only nurses can vaccinate is a significant issue in Japan. Clearly widening that to other people, as a host of other countries have done, would have significant advantages in ensuring that people get the vaccination when they need to. And finally, the role of government and local government. I am less minded to actually push national government to change the agenda in terms of vaccination. National governments have an awful lot of baggage, inevitably. I'm not saying the one in Japan, it's the ones everywhere. And if you look at how trusted local national governments are, it's very variable, with the most trusted countries being the Scandinavian countries. But it's really difficult and dangerous for government to actually push a process where, if it goes wrong, they see the effect of that over many, many years. And there are political ramifications for this. We need to be aware of that. But local governments certainly have a role to play. And I don't think we have influenced local government enough in Japan to actually make those changes. And the effect of influencing local government can really be significant. I had the privilege of being in Japan over a number of years to see what the effect, for example, of getting risk reduction in dementia into local government had on a population. It was transformational because we actually managed to convince the people who could make the difference. And I think this is the message that I would ask us to reflect upon. So thank you for listening to me. Back to you, Noriko.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Next speaker is Jason James, Director General, Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. Jason James has been Director General of the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation since 2011. Before that, he worked in the financial sector as a Japanese equity specialist and then as Director of the British Council of Japan. Jason's interest in Japan is broad, covering the economy, financial markets and tax, as well as Japanese history, literature and arts, and the relationship between the UK and Japan. Over to you, Jason.
Well, thank you very much, Noriko, for that kind introduction. So as you can see from the CV that was just read out, I'm not a medical or public health expert in any way. But what I think I can do here is shed some light on some of the specific issues affecting Japan, and particularly some of the legal issues in Japan surrounding vaccination. I don't believe that the Japanese are inherently more vaccine resistant than anybody else. Japanese parents, for instance, are very well accustomed to infants and children being vaccinated for all of the normal diseases. And some of those vaccines, which are very long established, have almost 100% take up. And I think one thing also that you do see in Japan is a concern with not causing a bother to other people. And that's particularly true, I think, among the elderly in Japan. So elderly people don't want to become a bother to their families by becoming ill. And people don't want to become a bother, for instance, by spreading disease on public transport, which is why there's a long tradition in Japan of wearing a mask on public transport if you've got a cold. And as Charles said, of course, with COVID, Japan got off to a slow start with vaccination, partly because of problems of availability of vaccines. But by the end, Japan ended up with a very good vaccination rate. And again, as Charles said, I think the Olympics were a factor there. There's quite a long history in Japan, for instance, with measles in the past, that whenever you've more or less eradicated a disease like this, it's brought in again from outside the country by some foreign visitors. So there was definitely a concern that even if the Japanese themselves were not having too big a problem with COVID, it would become much bigger once you had a large number of foreigners coming in for the Olympics. So I think in terms of the Japanese society and Japanese character, there's no obvious reason why people should be vaccine hesitant. But I think there are some legal problems, and they have been touched on a little bit by some of the other speakers, but I'd like to spend a little bit more time on that. The original Vaccination Act in Japan was introduced in 1948 when by the US occupation authorities after the war. And originally vaccination was mandatory. And the purpose of vaccination was public health rather than just the individual's health. And there was a penalty for non-compliance, a penalty of 3,000 yen, which these days isn't a huge amount of money, but it would have been worth a lot more in 1948. And then from around the 1970s, there were quite a few cases brought against the authorities for side effects relating to vaccines. And probably some of those side effects were genuine side effects that were caused by the vaccines in a small proportion of the people who'd been vaccinated. And some of them probably weren't genuine. There was actually no causality at all between the vaccine and the effect. And these cases rumbled on for quite a long time, generally not getting anywhere. But there was a bit of a turning point in 1992 when the Tokyo High Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs in one of these cases. And that ruling has made a big difference to the way the authorities behave on vaccination these days. The ruling of the Tokyo High Court was actually based on the Constitution of Japan. And in Article 29 of the Constitution, it states, private property may be taken for public use upon just compensation therefor. Well, obviously, the standard example of this is when the government takes real estate, to build a railway line or something. It does have the right to take your house and knock it down, but you have to be paid compensation. But effectively, the court ruled that when you tell people they have to vaccinate for public health reasons, in effect, you're taking private property, i.e. somebody's body, for public use. It's very hard to change the Japanese constitution. It's never been changed since it came into effect in 1947. So that wasn't really an option. The government could have appealed the ruling to higher courts, but at the time, media and public opinion was running very much in favor of the plaintiffs. So there was political pressure on the government not to appeal this ruling. So they didn't. Instead, they changed the vaccination law in 1994, 2 years after the Tokyo court ruling. And the way they changed it is, firstly, the legal basis of vaccination is no longer public health. So that was taken out. There is no legal basis for getting people to have vaccinations to protect other people. The only reason in Japanese law to get people to have a vaccination is to protect themselves. So that was, of course, to remove the problem of private property being taken for public use. So the issue of public use was taken out by that change in the law. Vaccinations also, of course, ceased to be mandatory. And the government has also been at pains ever since then to emphasize the risks associated with vaccinations. So actually, when the COVID vaccines came along and the Japanese government announced that the vaccine was being made available, the statement that was made to the media actually came across as quite negative, because they emphasized immediately that there were risks. And of course, in the case of COVID vaccinations, the testing had been relatively rushed. So I suppose the government was particularly concerned that it might be accused of underplaying the risks. But the net result was that there was quite a lot of emphasis on the risks in the early announcements that the Japanese authorities made. There has been a certain amount of misinformation about certain vaccines in Japan, and perhaps it's not such a relevant one for the elderly, but the HPV vaccine has been a particularly interesting case in Japan, because I think this vaccine is widely understood to be safe. It's been tested extensively around the world, but there were people in Japan arguing that it was unsafe, and the Japanese government kind of bottled it, and after having been recommending it officially and sending out letters to people, it then stopped doing that, and take-up of that vaccine fell from around 70% to less than 1%. At the Daiwa Foundation, actually, we had an event a year or so ago featuring a Japanese doctor, Riko Muranaka, who tried to counter this disinformation about the HPV vaccine. And she ended up with quite a few problems. She tried to publish a book about it, and the publishers themselves were afraid of being sued and didn't publish, although she did eventually find a publisher. And she accused one Japanese doctor of fabricating evidence and was sued for that, and she's ended up having to leave the country altogether. So I think, just to conclude, what I would say is I don't think the Japanese people are inherently particularly vaccine resistant. I think rather the opposite, if anything. I think the problem is that the authorities are somewhat vaccine resistant because they are concerned about the legal issues that I've mentioned.
Thank you, Jason. That's very good insight for information about Japan's history of the vaccination and the overall attitudes. And now we'd like to move on to the Q&A. But before I move on to the Q&A, just really highlight on the Japanese culture particularly. The Japanese culture is based on the trust. So the Arabella, they presented like the elderly people trust their sons and the doctors, but because they're long-term relationship, they have their own doctors have with the established long-term relationship. That is why if you have trust, if the doctor said the patient so and so you need to have a vaccination, the elderly people will have vaccination. Also, the child said, or the daddy, it's time for your vaccination. Yes, and I will go to the doctor to get one. And the public local authority, health authority, they are really trusted with health checkups and all that. So that is trust based trust. The trusting relationship is the making this vaccination possible. So in relation to that, so there is a question coming from, what are the dynamics influencing trust amongst all the adults with respect to vaccination? And is there any comments that for that? Probably we can start with Arabella. Did you see that trust through your needle work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you completely touched on it as well, you know, as has kind of been discussed as well. You know, there's a high level of trust in the government, and that's kind of local and national. Yeah, a kind of high level of trust, obviously, within sort of families and also influence there as well. You know, we heard lots of stories saying that you know, people's children had told them to, you know, go, and that was a really, really important factor. But yeah, I think, you know, there is a reasonable high level of trust, and I think there was a lot of, you know, the sort of ideologically opposed group was actually, you know, not very, very big in comparison to, you know, barriers around kind of lack of awareness or not full understanding of severity. So I think definitely, you know, that there's lots of space to kind of increase those two sort of barriers as the kind of key ones. Yeah, just really around sort of awareness and severity versus kind of trust of the vaccine or something like that.
Do you see anything Jason, you see lots of see through your interaction with Japan and Japanese culture, how this trust working between in terms of relation to the taking vaccination? Can you see some examples?
Well, is that for me, Noriko?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the trust in the authorities generally is very high. Trust in the medical authorities certainly is high, and of course, there's a good reason for that. I mean, the Japanese have some of the longest lifespans in the world, so I think it's clear that the medical authorities in general have been doing a pretty good job. As I think it was Charles said, there have been some issues in the past which may affect the thinking of older people in particular. And I'm thinking of, for instance, some of the industrial pollution incidents and so on that occurred back in the high growth period of the 1960s and 70s. And there were, of course, cases of government cover-ups in some of those instances. And maybe more recently, of course, the Fukushima nuclear accident perhaps didn't reflect terribly well on the Japanese authorities either. But in general, and certainly in the medical area, I would say that you know, Japanese people do absolutely trust their doctors, and if their doctors recommend them to have a vaccination, they will have it.
Just a comment from me, really, because I touched on this issue of trust in my intervention, and I think I would obviously agree completely with what James has said in terms of in terms of the issues of trust in government. But I think we're missing a trick if we don't spend more time thinking of influencing the profession that was mentioned, but also employers, because the level of trust in employers in Japan and in large corporations is very high. In some respects, it's diametrically opposite, one could say, to the situation in some Western countries where large corporations are not trusted, but they tend to be more trusted in Japan. And seeing what the experience of using employers to vaccinating COVID may mean, this could be an area where perhaps there could be some benefit in influencing.
Thank you, Charles, for your expertise, from the expertise and injecting the conversation. Now they are like to moving on to the next questions. How do you see the urgency protecting age population by vaccines? Especially the Arabella mentioned the Japanese people, they are healthy people, really thinking they are healthy, and it's not really urgent that why they need to have the vaccination. So maybe the Arabella can just explore on that. Do you see that sort of resistance or the idea that they are not needing vaccination to prevent the illness?
Yeah, and I think maybe, David, you have perhaps more access to kind of stats and sort of information kind of on this. But yeah, I mean, we were obviously kind of looking to understand these barriers. I think that, there is a high understanding or kind of mindset of, I'm healthy, so don't need the need. So it's this idea of like, urgency kind of to protect before it happens. And I think that there's, concern around that in that, because there was lots of sort of discussion around, if I get ill, then I can just, go to hospital and get there'll be something that, can make me better. Which is, hopefully in a lot of cases that will be fine, but in, a lot of cases that won't. And, lots of people are more vulnerable. And so it's trying to shift this mindset away from, kind of fixing the problem when it happens to this, like obviously kind of preventative mindset. But yeah, David, I'm sure you have probably more to add on your end.
Yeah, and perhaps I won't sort of just go through the numbers exactly, but one of the motivations around doing this bit of work was clearly that, for example, uptake of routine vaccines in adults in Japan is lower, as Mike mentioned in his video, relatively low. I perhaps just want to use this opportunity to promote something we're going to be launching fairly soon. So alongside the World Health Assembly, in May, we're going to be launching a new global prevention index, which will look at a whole range of different indicators across well over 100 countries. And I suppose I would just encourage you to all join us there virtually or face-to-face in Geneva, where we'll be launching sort of a collection of stats around which countries are doing well. And so yeah, I won't go into any more detail, but I just wanted to pitch that.
Well, thank you, David. The urgency of the protection is also coming from the government as well. Maybe Charles can elaborate that have you seen that from the local authorities or national government? Are they really thinking about the implementing vaccinations more, their urgency or anything? They have other issues.
You're on mute, Charles.
I had to do it once, didn't I? Be on mute. Thank you. So thank you, Noriko. Yes, we are seeing that in different countries, and but of course we need to remember that different countries all take their individual approaches to address this, which is perfectly okay. I think it's a little bit of a stretch to suddenly expect Japan, with its history and the legal issues, which James described very articulately, to suddenly flip and say everybody must get vaccinated or everybody should get vaccinated. And this to happen overnight, and this to be the driver, because I don't think that will work or is realistic. But I think what is realistic is actually doing a whole host of small things like having some discussion around ensuring that vaccination becomes part of a health check. That would have enormous influence upon that population, because it will be discussed rather than ignored during something that happens to everybody in Japan. So that would be useful. Having some thought around ensuring one actually gets a process of integrated surveillance in places like Japan for disease in general. And we talked about the importance of data already. And really the lack of interoperability and EMRs and everything else to go with that. Now, it's impossible to really do that until one has a process where one has transparency around data. And clearly there is a way to go in Japan. So there's something more that can be done over there. So I'm really quite positive around that. Other countries, some countries are taking far more aggressive approaches to vaccination, childhood and adults. But then, of course, one has to remember the context of the countries and where they come from. And in the social, medical systems that we see in Europe, for example, there is a great drive to vaccination. You only have to go to Scandinavia, to the Netherlands, even to southern Spain to see what effect that can have on populations, and a really very, very positive effect. But that's a long journey, and I think we've got to put the bits in place in Japan to get that journey started and turbocharged.
Perhaps I can add, and I think it is really difficult and completely understandably difficult, not just Japan, that to create urgency around prevention. Because in effect you're trying to create urgency around something that where the impact may well be long term. So there is a sort of a behavioural challenge that we have for both individuals but also for governments. Clearly there is more that could be done, and I think to add to Charles's list, the World Health Organization, as part of the World Health Organization Immunization Agenda 2030, every country is supposed to have a national plan for immunization. Very few do at the moment, and those that do say very, very little about adults. So clearly we need to make sure that we use that platform. Secondly, in terms of clearly post-COVID, there is a risk, not only that we don't have urgency, that governments find themselves actually cutting preventative spending across the world. Inevitably, there are financial pressures, whether they be economic or health, to focus on acute or other issues. For us, I think there is very strong evidence that if governments across the world could spend closer to 6% of their healthcare budgets on prevention than the 2.8% that they do at the moment, this would have a very, very significant impact on long-term health. And government ministers, finance ministers and health ministers at G20 and G7 say the right thing, but actually it's often the case that it's a lot harder to move the needle on that as well. So we do need to focus on that. And let me give my second plug for those of you joining us from Japan. We are planning to be running some events alongside the G7 in Japan in May, and there was a slide later on with some details, but I would encourage you to all hopefully join us at some of these events so we can talk about some of these issues and indeed this work while we're there.
Just a little comment to add on to what David said about vaccination. It was and I'm going to use the experience of the United Kingdom. Again, not because we can learn anything from it, but it's interesting in terms of the psyche. This is a country which actually where vaccination was talked about as being something very beneficial. Lots of central government discussion and encouragement to vaccination. The messages were really quite clear around the importance of this. The times where vaccination was the highest were the times when COVID was rampant, really rampant, when we're in real trouble. That's when vaccinations went up. And also the times when the vaccine was scarcest. So paradoxically, the only times, or the maximum times where people want something are when they can't get it and when the danger is actually staring them in the face. And this is the paradox, of course, with vaccination. If you're vaccinating against, say, shingles in older people, the first answer is, I don't have shingles, so why should I get vaccinated? I'm putting something in my body which could make me worse than I am at the moment. I'll take the risk. And the argument needs to be developed around, okay, take the risk. Let's quantify that risk. Let's quantify the risk of you getting a problem with your shingles vaccination. Then, of course, it's your decision. But it may be a no-brainer, really, to go ahead and have the vaccination. And that is really what we spent a lot of time trying to do, develop those arguments, because it's a perfectly reasonable riposte of people, by the way. So let's not devalue it.
Thank you, Charles. That we partially answered the questions coming from Devapriya Chakraborty. The person was asking, how do you apply the lessons learned from Japan to countries where the trust in government and corporation is not as high? So maybe Charles can summarize your points about like quantifying the risk and the making an argument, but how could you get this letting government knows and they actually they are making that a big move to implement?
I think you're on mute again, Charles.
Thank you, Noriko, because it's absolutely true. The trust in Japan is high, and I would actually think ask people to think of the difficulties places like the United States had, for example. With vaccination, where there were multitudes of small or large regional differences in terms of approaches, where in some states, actually, there was no vaccination at all available. In some other states, there was vaccination available. That unanimity of message, that purity of message is really very, very important. And I think trying to deliver that must be one of the lessons which we have learned. I think we talked about the lessons all through this seminar, and I'm not going to take the few minutes that remain just to repeat what we said. There are lots we can learn from COVID, and I think trying to reproduce some of the good things and avoiding the problems we had is really the direction we need to go in. Thank you.
Well, Charles, thank you very much. Do you have any final words, Jason, for the about trust and the how this can be related to other countries?
I'm not sure I can help much with the other countries, but just one final thought from me would be maybe it's important to target the children of some of these elderly people. A lot of Japanese elderly people are actually very old, and in many cases they're being cared for by their children, or even if they're not being cared for by their children, an eye is being kept on them by their children, you know, from afar. They call in once a day or something to check they're still okay. And I think they would be quite easily persuadable by their children, you know, you should have this vaccine to protect yourself. So it might well be worth targeting those carers and children of the elderly people, as well as the elderly people themselves.
Thank you, Jason. Now it's about to finish this seminar. I'd like to just sum up the important points that the report said about the complex picture of the vaccination problem in Japan. But however, However, this is really rapidly changing by the COVID, the impact from the COVID and high intake from the COVID vaccination. So how this trust and the government would change the implementation of how they change the laws of the injection law only done by the doctors and nurses could be changed. That will be something that we could encourage the Japanese government to show some example, and that's what I think. The important things we still haven't done, we could learn more from the Japan about how they stay healthy, and I think that's something we should keep collaborating with the Japanese researchers and the UK and health researchers. So thank you to all our speakers and everyone who joined us for the webinar today. ILC's next event will be this Thursday, 30th March at 4 p.m. This webinar will explore ILC's new report, Trial and Error on Supporting Age Diversity in Clinical Trials. ILC will be explaining its key findings from the expert roundtable in January 2023 and set out some recommendations for stakeholders at all stages of the trial process to improve age diversity. Please visit the events tab on ILC website for more details. For news on ILC's latest webinars and to stay up to date with all ILC news, please visit ILC's website at ilc-uk.org.uk. Join the mailing list and follow them on Facebook and Twitter at ILC-UK, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for all our newest webinars and videos. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to welcome you at another webinar or event in the near future. Thank you, and thank you panelists for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Noriko.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Arabella.